Daniel Rhodes, and I'll be talking with Naveed Haider today about white privilege. In the 21st century, where social criticism abounds, the phrase white privilege is heard with growing regularity. Understandably, people might ask themselves, what is white privilege? Is it real or is it something invented by radical left-wing academics who hate America? Let's begin by answering the first question. What is white privilege? White privilege refers to the advantages enjoyed by white people simply because they are white. But what are these advantages? If I, as a white person, was only familiar with the experiences of fellow white people, there are things about my life which I would not view as privileges. As Peggy McIntosh observed, I would likely take them for granted and think they were simply a part of every person's experience, regardless of race. Her examples include the fact that if a traffic cop pulls me over, or if the IRS audits my tax return, I can be sure that I haven't been singled out because of my race. Furthermore, when I take a job with an affirmative action employer, I can do so without having coworkers suspect that I got it because of race. I can also be sure that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not work against me. If I need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing I can afford in an area I want to live.
But aren't achievements based on merit? According to Tal Ford Gang's article, "While I'll Never Apologize for My White Privilege," linked below, let's examine how his arguments shape up to our understanding of the holistic system. He has three main takeaways. Firstly, his argument says that accusing people of white privilege undermines the narrative that individuals can become successful by working hard. Simply put, if you work hard and utilize opportunities, you will reach your ambitions and be successful. Moreover, on number two, he talks about how accusing people of white privilege takes in no consideration of past instances of oppression done to that individual. He talks about how most people's conception of white privilege does not take into account the past instance of oppression that he has faced. In his case, his Jewish forefathers had to escape death and work hard to accumulate his family's wealth. And that's why he has nothing to apologize for, because his advantage is not the result of privilege. Lastly, he quotes that America is a country that grants equal protection under the law to its citizens and that cares not about religion or race, but the content of your character. This is his way of saying that America, if you have enough passion and if you work hard, America, the system America is built on, is going to grant you those opportunities, which makes you successful in his life. Now let's take a look at some of the rebuttals that we have for this Fordgang's article. To concede that there is some truth to what he says, but we say that his perspective is lacking. First of all, his family's past oppression does not make his advantages as a white or white passing person disappear. His notion of equal protection under the law is simply untrue, as we will show later in the data where Daniel will talk about instances and statistics of oppression. Just because he does not experience certain disadvantages does not mean that they're non-existent. Yes, his hard work was needed to get him where he is in a very elite institution, but that hard work existed within a life opportunity. His opportunities aren't limited by the same societal barriers and institutions which hold back people of color. So let's look at a hypothetical case scenario where we imagine two kids from different backgrounds getting into Princeton, the exact institution Ford Gang is attending, and being a very elite university. So let's look at two kids. Number one, we got Darnell, who is an African American kid from a relatively lower income neighborhood in New York City. Let's take a look at Brad, who is a white kid who comes from a very privileged environment, right? And let's kind of weigh their odds against getting into Princeton. And we need to consider in different factors for that. For example, we need to consider whether they have the ability to afford college, in which case Darnell might not have enough money to attend college as opposed to Brad. We take a look at how good their education was, in the sense of like how good were their ACT and ACT scores. Darnell might not have the same facilities as Brad had in case of actually going to a great tutor and preparing well for the standardized exam, which is very important for getting into college. Let's look at a social environment, whether Brad or Darnell had the social environment which kind of nurtured them. Maybe Darnell did not have to grow up with the fear of getting accused by police every day or like face violence, as opposed to Brad, who might have had a more nurturing environment. Let's look at how good their high school education was. Maybe Darnell went to a public school, which did not grant him enough opportunities, did not grant him good recommendation letters or even a good counselor, as opposed to Brad, who went to a private school and had all those opportunities. So even when we look at these two individuals, it's not only about merit or hard work, but the structures that kind of work behind the scene, which enables them to get to Princeton, which is a very elite college. And a conclusion from this is that the odds are stacked against Darnell in the system because how institutions are formed historically in a white dominated society, which we'll rather elaborate in our next slides.
Other critics of white privilege take further issue with some of the aforementioned claims. Jordan Peterson, in his video about debunking white privilege, see the link below, presents 4 criticisms. 1. There is no evidence to support the claim that race is more important than other differences in identity. 2. Any evidence which does exist is simply anecdotal and therefore cannot support sweeping generalizations. 3. To the point of living where one wants, any such restriction is a result of wealth inequality, not racial inequality. And 4. Not only is the existence of white privilege questionable, its notions attributes to white members of a community the attributes of that community, i.e. white privilege, because they are white, which is itself racist. The relative importance of race compared to other descriptors is indeed a complicated debate. Regardless, contrary to Peterson's claim, there is strong quantitative evidence to support the idea that race alone impacts such areas of life as one's job, one's criminal record, and yes, one's ability to rent or buy a home. Let's begin with the topic of renting or buying a home. In the year 2000, researchers trained both white and black volunteers to act as though they were looking to rent or buy a home. A white person and a black person with the same qualifications would go to the same broker and record their experience. More black people were asked to fill out rental applications, but they were neither informed of nor taken to as many apartments as their white counterparts. In contrast, when buying a home, although black people were informed of and shown more options, brokers followed up less frequently and offered less financial assistance than their white counterparts. Race can also impact one's job prospects. In 2004, researchers submitted job applications using equivalent resume credentials, save for a difference in the applicant's name. They took the most popular white names and the most popular African American names in the area of their research and recorded the percentage of the time each group was called back by the potential employer. They found that African American men were called back approximately 3% less of the time than their white counterparts. That is a relative decrease of 34% just because an applicant's name is, quote, black. Racial discrimination also exists within a legal context. The Stanford Open Policing Project found that the number of minority arrests per 100 traffic stops, black persons in blue, Hispanic persons in green, is greater than the number of white arrests per 100 traffic stops in the vast majority of regions across the United States. Once arrested, the outcome will depend both on your race and the race of your jurors. Researchers analyzed trial data from the state of Florida and found that the likelihood of being convicted of a crime, whether you are white or black, will depend on the racial makeup of the jury. They found that if the jury has no black jurors, the likelihood of a black defendant being convicted is 15% higher than the white counterpart, a relative increase of 19%. In contrast, if there is at least one black juror, the likelihood of being convicted is almost equal. Whites were convicted 2% more often, which is itself a relative increase of 3%. In summary, it's important to mention that you yourself don't have to be racist to benefit from others' discriminatory practices. So the notion that white privilege is itself a racist notion is, to put it lightly, hogwash.
On an ending note, let's talk about Marilyn Fryer and her birdcage analogy. And what essentially it hints is that our inability to look at the whole picture and just nitpicking certain aspects. And we think this quote really summarizes what her whole video is about. She says, if you look closely at the cage, you cannot see the other bars. It is only when you take a step back and take a look at the whole do you see how multiple bars work together to form a cage. Those on the outside are also restricted. They are locked out of that location. Fryer talks about how a bird focuses on one wire and tries to get past it, but it cannot comprehend the other wires around it, and how those also act as a barrier to freedom. We can look at white privilege in the same way. People tend to concentrate and debate on one or two factors, but they cannot comprehend the numerous structural barriers that exist to hinder freedom. That is analogous in case of the oppressed people who are inside the cage. They cannot look at the whole picture, but also people who are outside of that cage, people like Fort Gang, who thinks that just one or two wires is enough to let that bird go, but not the whole cage.
In summary, it's safe to say that white privilege is indeed real, it affects multiple parts of our lives, and, as Farr pointed out, works systematically to oppress anyone who is not white.